Welcome to tonight's talk, Ruskinland, How John Ruskin Shapes Our World, with the esteemed writer and journalist, Andrew Hill. My name is Nerissa Taysom, and I manage the public programme at the Watts Gallery Artists Village, and I'm delighted to be hosting this evening's event. As it happens, I'm speaking from the very road in Denmark Hill where Ruskin lived, but wherever you are joining us from around the world, a very warm welcome to our online public programme. Before I introduce Andrew and say a few words about tonight's talk, I have a few housekeeping notes to share with you. Hopefully you've all received the online code of conduct that we sent you with your tickets. Please observe this throughout this evening's talk. Andrew will speak for about 35 to 40 minutes, and this will be followed by a Q&A session. We ask with the Q&A that you share your questions through the chat function, through the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom. And I will moderate these questions and we will ask them to Andrew at the end of his talk. If you have any technical issues this evening, please contact the online duty manager, Caris, who has shared her email with you in the chat function. And a reminder that tonight's talk will be recorded and may be used on our website following this event. But we ask that you please don't record it on any of your own devices. And lastly, of course, we're here to promote Andrew's book this evening, and we will be sharing a link to book sales both in the chat function and also in the email that we send to you after this event. Tonight marks a series of firsts for the Watts Gallery. This is our first live online talk as part of our current digital Watts at Home programme, and is also the first evening event exploring the life, work and radical influence of John Ruskin to accompany our current exhibition onto this last 200 years of John Ruskin. This exhibition, which went live just before lockdown back in March and will run until the 1st of November, is a collaborative endeavour with the collections and curators of Yale Centre for British Art and the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library. And it's been a great privilege for us to have this show for the last few months. And I would strongly urge you to book a time ticket to visit the gallery before the exhibition closes on the 1st of November. And now to introduce our speaker, Andrew Hill. Hi, Andrew. Andrew is an award-winning journalist and author. He is currently the associate editor and management editor of the Financial Times and writes a weekly column on business, strategy and leadership. In 2016, he published his first book, Leadership in the Headlines, and was named Business Commentator of the Year. Andrew is currently the chair of the Blueprint Trust, which supports businesses to be a force for good. So a very Ruskin endeavour, Andrew. The genesis of Andrew's book, Ruskinland, that he'll talk about this evening, came in 2009 when he bought a copy of Onto This Last, the namesake of our exhibition, and Ruskin's bitter attack against free market economics. In reading this book, he realised the contemporary relevance of Ruskin across a range of subjects: education, politics, nature, craft and art. Part biography, part travelogue, the book was published last year to rave reviews. And Andrew, it's our great pleasure and privilege to welcome you to the Watts Gallery's public programme this evening. And I will now hand over to you. Thank you.
Hello, good evening. Thank you very much, Nerissa, and welcome to Ruskinland. Welcome specifically to the part of Ruskinland that overlaps with what we might call Wattsland, the landscape mapped out by G.F. Watts over almost exactly the same period as Ruskin himself. They were born only a couple of years apart, Watts in 1817, and Ruskin in 1819. They each lived over 80 years and they corresponded often mainly about painting. Ruskin was an admirer of Watts. He called him the only real painter of history or thought we have in England. And I like the story told of the critic Ruskin visiting Watts in his studio sometime in the 1850s, where he found the painter in despair, having just signed a painting, G.F. Watts' Finis, the end. Ruskin apparently took a piece of charcoal and added et initium, and the beginning. When Ruskin died in 1900, Watts, who was supposed to be a pallbearer at the funeral, instead sent a wreath made of leaves cut from the laurel tree in his garden at Limnerslees, near where the gallery is now. It was an honor, as I mentioned in my book, that he had afforded to only three other giants of Victorian culture: Frederick Leighton, the artist, Edward Burne-Jones, and Alfred Lord Tennyson. I want to just mention one other missed opportunity 7 years before Ruskin's death, when Watts planned to visit Ruskin at his house Brantwood in the Lake District to paint his portrait. Alas, at the last minute, Watts fell ill and had to cancel. He wrote a letter to Ruskin apologizing. It was probably delivered in the official Brantwood post bag that I know is on display in the Watts Gallery exhibition. Watts said in his letter that he regretted that the great thinker had given up writing by that stage. I cannot feel but that civilization having gone so wrong, very great and radical changes are inevitable and perhaps very near, he wrote. And I wish every voice that can be raised with authority should be heard. So 201 years since John Ruskin's birth in 1819, here we are in the midst of a pandemic that may again bring about very great and radical changes. And we might again wish for Ruskin's voice to be heard, as I shall explain. But first of all, who was John Ruskin and why do his ideas still matter? Well, in our minds, if we know anything about him, we tend to have this famous image taken just 6 years before Ruskin's death. That's probably the nearest we have to the sort of portrait Watts might have painted had he made it to Brantwood. And by this stage, as I've mentioned, Ruskin was living as a virtually silent recluse at the house overlooking Coniston Water. Yet this sage, social critic, artist, scientist, environmental campaigner was perhaps the most famous living Victorian, sorry, Watts fans, apart from Queen Victoria herself, whose long life almost exactly mapped onto his. Even so, after he died in 1900, this remarkable polymath's fame quickly faded. Visiting the Ruskin Museum in Sheffield for a BBC radio talk just ahead of the 50th anniversary of Ruskin's death, the writer Lawrence Dugard-Peach conducted a vox pop of passers-by and said not one knew that Ruskin was a writer. Not 1 in 50 knew anything that he had written, such is fame. And for much of the 20th century, Ruskin's reputation seemed as dead and buried as the man himself. And his ideas were overtaken by the industrial, political, economic, military, and even artistic forces that ravaged and shaped the century after his death. His ill-starred marriage to Effie Gray had ended in annulment in 1854 on grounds of non-consummation and incurable impotency, the source of many rumors that continue unfairly, I think, to haunt his reputation. So for most people, this is the image that sticks in their minds of the Victorian age's best known, most controversial and most prolific intellectual. Some dreary old has-been with a beard, as that BBC interviewer called him. Prudish, aloof, self-righteous, conservative to a fault, and resistant to progress. Let's think, though, about the younger man. This is Ruskin, age 24, in 1843, when, as author of a radical reassessment of G.M.W. Turner, Modern Painters, he was in the very first flush of his first extraordinary celebrity. So what was Ruskin like? Well, he was extraordinarily difficult to categorize. I'm never satisfied that I've handled the subject properly till I have contradicted myself at least 3 times, he said. And his career divided into 2 halves. From about the time of this painting through to 1860, he built his reputation as an art critic. But then he surprised both his own fans and his enemies with his sudden swerve into social and political criticism. He was raised in a strict Protestant evangelical tradition, literally learning passages of the Bible with his mother. but he underwent an unconversion in his late 30s as he realized, partly through the Catholic art he came to revere, that the old tradition had little left for him. At different times, he described himself as a violent Tory of the old school and a communist of the old school, reddist also of the red, which always makes me think that must have been some school. In short, he was like all of us, someone who changed his mind. And I think this makes him a more sympathetic figure than the forbidding bearded prophet that we see in that picture from his last years. I sometimes try to imagine a modern personality who resembled Ruskin, but the truth is you have to conceive of an amalgam of more than one person. He had the encyclopedic knowledge of art, history and culture of a Stephen Fry, and the same pulling power. He was a hugely popular public speaker, attracting sellout audiences and lively press criticism wherever he went, with his controversial views and idiosyncratic approach. He had the desire to challenge of journalists like Emily Maitlis or Andrew Marr, the polemical and polarizing elan of a pre-COVID Boris Johnson, and some of the nostalgic harping on the past of Jacob Rees-Mogg, combined with the progressive instincts of the Green Party's Caroline Lucas, though without any of the party politics, which he always loathed. Ruskin was first and foremost a scientist. His early passion, sustained throughout his life, was for geology. And he had the scientific curiosity and precision of a Brian Cox, and ultimately commanded the respect of a David Attenborough and the attention of a Greta Thunberg in areas such as natural history and the environment. Not to mention, of course, that he had the eye and the artistic and painterly skills of a David Hockney. And even this thought experiment doesn't really cover the whole of Ruskin's extraordinary polymathic range and his ability to connect all those varied interests and more. And I wrote Ruskinland in part to express that range, but also to answer the question I most often hear from people who know just one part of Ruskin's amazing output, 9 million words before you even start counting his letters, let alone the paintings and drawings. And that question is, wasn't he the bloke who, so yes, he was the bloke who sowed the seeds of the modern welfare state, including state pensions and healthcare free at the point of delivery, whose progressive support for the education of girls and working men laid the foundations for free public schools and adult education institutions, whose acute appreciation of natural beauty, notably the Lake District, underpinned the National Trust and inspired the creation of the national parks, whose sensitivity to pollution and environmental change, decades before it was considered other than a local phenomenon, prefigured the modern green movement, whose work inspired William Morris and through him the arts and crafts movement and the early socialists, whose violent critique of free market economics unto this last was the title that most influenced the first intake of Labour MPs in 1906, more than 40 years after its publication. He was the bloke who staked his reputation on Turner and the pre-Raphaelites when they were under fire, ensuring their reputations have continued to burn brightly, even as his has suffered. And he was the bloke who, in parallel with a public career of great success and celebrity, concealed a mental frailty that ultimately, through a series of breakdowns and periods of deep depression, condemned him to final years of silence and reclusiveness. The other reason that I wrote Ruskinland was to trace his influence today, and this is where I'd like to concentrate my focus. So as a teenager studying the history of art, I knew about Ruskin's role as artist and critic. When I revisited Venice in 2018 for the first time in decades, I realized that the places and works that had astonished and energized Ruskin in the 19th century had been on my itinerary in the second half of the 20th, when I first visited his paradise of cities, age 16, with a school art trip. And as a regular traveler to the Lake District, this is Brantwood, I knew about Ruskin's love of the region. And I was also well aware that Oxford boasted a Ruskin College and a Ruskin School of Art. But it wasn't, as Nerissa has mentioned, until I visited Brantwood in 2009 and picked up a copy of Unto This Last that I started to add some of the other pieces. And I found in the essays laying into the smug captains of Victorian capitalism lots of parallels with our contemporary concerns about inequality, the social uselessness of some forms of finance, the excesses of executive pay, the way in which chief executives had abandoned their position as what Ruskin would have called honest merchants, the uses of wealth and the production of its toxic opposite, which Ruskin called ilth. Today was Ruskin's personal motto, stamped on later editions of his books, powerful, simple, and still highly relevant. And he rallied followers to take on practical challenges and to do now what they might otherwise put off until tomorrow. And many of Ruskin's insights are often strikingly modern. For instance, here is his withering assessment of the contemporary condition from the 5th volume of Modern Painters, no less relevant now than it was when it was published in 1860. People appear, he wrote, to have no other desire or hope but to have large houses and to be able to move fast. His bold ideas, laying out a broad national curriculum, for instance, or envisaging ways in which town planners could improve the lives of ordinary workers, meant he was often accused of utopianism. But he advised followers to cut the word utopian out of their dictionary altogether. Things are either possible or impossible. If the thing is impossible, you need not trouble yourselves about it. If possible, try for it. So today we're all living in Ruskinland, but some are more closely bound into the network of Ruskin's influence than others, even if they don't realize it. The cover of my book is a mural in Ruskin, Florida, a community on Tampa Bay that was founded in the early 1900s by idealists who were inspired by Ruskin's thinking. It makes John Ruskin probably the only great Victorian intellectual to have a drive-in movie theatre named after him. In fact, once you start looking, Ruskin's name crops up everywhere, and not just in the institutions that he directly influenced, such as the Ruskin School of Art in Oxford. A few years ago, John Lewis sold a 7-foot artificial Christmas tree called the Ruskin Pine, with rugged upswept branches and pine cones for a realistic look, as part of its Ruskin House range of baubles, linen and glassware, in a nod to the arts and crafts movement, which Morris, Ruskin's great follower, inspired. I found his name on affordable luxury bags by a small startup called Ruskin.London, combining Herdwick sheep's wool from the Lake District with Italian leather, on beer brewed in Kirby Lonsdale, where Ruskin deemed the view down the Lune Valley as one of the loveliest in England, therefore in the world, a typical piece of Ruskin hyperbole, and perhaps most bizarrely, on the bespoke leather interiors of Land Rover Defenders, produced by a company called Ruskin Design. And I can't resist including this one that I came across last year, an Indian company selling shirts online. Somehow, John Ruskin's name has become associated with desirable combinations of craft skills, which he encouraged and praised, nature and the environment, and creativity, as well as a sense of rootedness in community that I think is increasingly valuable. What else do Ruskin's life and ideas offer us today? Well, I would say insights into 7 areas: seeing and understanding, reflection, provenance, humans and our environment, thoughtful planning and building, ethical leadership and meaningful work, and connectedness. Ruskin's great lesson was the vital importance of seeing the world more clearly to understand it better. And this he proposed we should achieve through drawing, this one of his beloved Venice. His aphorisms, including some that sound Ruskinian but can't be traced to his work, continue to circulate on Twitter and other social media. In truth, though, it's hard to imagine him cramming his thoughts into a 280-character tweet. But who wouldn't want to follow the 19th century's greatest eye on Instagram? Ruskin wanted us to devote time to this process of understanding, which makes him in many ways a pioneer of slow travel, slow food, and living in the moment. This is his brougham, the type of carriage in which he liked to travel from a very early age, at just 7 miles an hour, always in fair weather so that he could see everything clearly. Ruskin believed that art, buildings, work and craft should be rooted in the truth of the landscapes and communities around us. He understood and conveyed to his readers that planning, architecture and building itself had a moral quality. And he inspired Frank Lloyd Wright, Le Corbusier and others in the world of architecture. Ruskin's moral code for architecture was consistent with his great environmental legacy. He thought deeply about how to encourage the fruitful coexistence of humans and the environment, speaking out about industrial pollution and what we would now call climate change before the term was even known. And he was able to do this because throughout his life he chronicled and observed and painted and drew very closely the landscapes and skyscapes around him, painting the Lake District, the Alps, Italy and elsewhere. So when later in life he spotted changes, he was able to go back and find the evidence for the changes that he had seen. He fought to conserve the Lake District from overdevelopment, but he didn't simply want Lakeland to be preserved unvisited, which is one reason why he was a pillar of the successful 2017 application to UNESCO to turn the Lake District into a World Heritage Site. Above all, as I hinted at the beginning of my talk, he was acutely aware of how everything was connected. He was the central weaver of a network of diverse interests, from geology to architecture, from history to social reform, from the environment to economics. He was a one-man worldwide web, what modish strategy gurus would call a joiner of dots, integrating, a bit like the exhibition now on at the Watts Gallery, the aesthetic, the socio-political and the ecological. In a lecture in 1853, Ruskin conjured a fantastical vision of how painters might chronicle and record developments in multiple fields if they were to divide into two great armies of historians and naturalists. The historian artists, he said, would paint with absolute faithfulness historically significant buildings, cities, battlefields. The artist naturalists would similarly record plants, animals, scenery, clouds, even each recess of every mountain chain of Europe. And the output would be stored in national galleries to be put within reach of the common people. And this sounds like a strong case for what we would now call interdisciplinary studies, not to mention national galleries and museums. Ruskin was also one of the first standard bearers for meaningful work, which shone through the creativity of the anonymous builders of the great Gothic cathedrals he admired and visited. And this was really the link between the two halves of his career that I mentioned earlier. From his praise for the builders of the cathedrals, through his applause for the meticulous workmanship of the pre-Raphaelites, to his concern for what we would now probably call the well-being of the workers. Because of his father's wealth, Ruskin really never had to do a conventional paid job in his life, yet he felt driven to make the world a happier place for those people who did have to work to survive. And he had plenty to say about work and about workers. In fact, he helped outline many of the ideas that we now consider to be new, even radical, about redefining work to make it more meaningful, more productive, more enjoyable, and about offsetting the dangers of mechanization and automation. This is Ford Madox Brown's masterpiece work, completed in 1865, which depicts navvies building the water supply through Hampstead in London, a version of which hangs in Manchester Art Gallery and another in Birmingham. Brown's aim here was to show the heroism of ordinary work by showing various exemplars from the navvies themselves to brain workers, as he called them, such as the author and polemicist Thomas Carlyle on the right there in the hat, who was also Ruskin's mentor and friend. Brown did at one point think of putting Ruskin in the picture, but he disliked Ruskin, and even though he certainly benefited indirectly from Ruskin's championing of the pre-Raphaelites, as a whole, Ruskin was rather rude about Brown's paintings, and Brown, snubbed by the greatest art critic of the age, didn't help Ruskin's reputation by inventing the term Ruskinized as a synonym for castrated. This mutual disrespect, bordering on antipathy, is a pity for lots of reasons, I think, but one of them is that I also think the two men thought similarly about the value of work. I've had a bit of an obsession with this painting since the 1980s, and in 2012, when it travelled down to London for the big pre-Raphaelite exhibition, I got to indulge it again. I persuaded the Financial Times that I should recreate this tableau for the FT magazine and brought together equivalents of Brown's heroes, including BT workers in the day-glow jackets there as the navvies, the clergyman Giles Fraser as the brain worker, technologist Dame Steve Shirley at the back with the stripy jacket on as the philanthropist, and unemployed philosophy graduate Elise Elliott and Bean Stocks, a vendor of the Big Issue magazine. And I asked each of them in a series of interviews why they worked and what their work meant to them. And almost all mentioned the same two things. They worked for money, of course, but they also worked for the sense of meaning and fulfillment that their work gave them. And Ruskin wrote this resounding passage in The Stones of Venice, a decade before Brown painted work. The great cry that rises from all our manufacturing cities, louder than their furnace blast, is all in very deed for this, that we manufacture everything there except men. We blanch cotton and strengthen steel and refine sugar and shape pottery, but to brighten, to strengthen, to refine, or to form a single living spirit never enters into our estimate of advantages. The evil of modern manufacturing, he continued, could be combated only by a right understanding on the part of all classes of what kinds of labour are good for men, raising them and making them happy. Ruskin put his ideas into practice as a teacher of drawing to artisans in the 1850s at the newly formed Working Men's College in Holborn. And it might seem eccentric to teach drawing to working men, but Ruskin explained that at the college he aimed not to make a carpenter an artist, but to make him happier as a carpenter. And making the world a happier place is still the objective of the Charitable Guild of St. George, of which I'm a companion. The Working Men's College now in Camden still exists and has been restyled as the WMC. 75% of the learners there are now women, so it makes sense. And you can still take drawing classes there. I visited one for my book. But much of the effort of educators at the WMC is lifting people onto the first rung of the working ladder through teaching them English as a second language or basic essential math skills. John Ruskin launched his artisan students down new paths. People like Henry Swan, the vegetarian bicycle riding pioneer of boomerang throwing, who became curator of his museum in Sheffield, or George Allen, who became his publisher, and the Allen in Allen and Unwin. In the same way, the Camden College still stages an annual prize for the best accounts by learners of how WMC changed my life. One of the most striking parallels with today's world of work is that as we move into the fourth industrial revolution, introducing machine learning, algorithms, and artificial intelligence into the workplace, we hear plenty of concerns that echo Ruskin's and Brown's during the first and second such revolutions about what disruption may do to our jobs and how work may be stripped of meaning and creativity. And I've noticed in my day job as the management editor of the Financial Times how the current management literature is starting to draw attention to some of the qualities that those Victorian thinkers, writers, and artists wished to champion as they saw workers dragged into a dehumanizing industrial machine. Ruskin conceived the idea that the anonymous builders and carvers of the cathedrals and other buildings he loved could only have created such art if they had the freedom to exercise their human capabilities of curiosity, imagination, intuition, creativity, and empathy. When John Ruskin wrote Under This Last in the 1860s, he railed against the 19th century equivalent of modern automation and mechanization. He spoke about how rich in every sense Britain would be if it aimed instead to manufacture souls of a good quality. And companies I write about in my day job at the Financial Times, such as Michelin and Microsoft, are putting these kinds of ideas into practice, giving frontline workers more latitude to exercise their human capabilities. Ruskin abhorred technology. In fact, in later life, his solutions included a return to a sort of rural feudalism, and he favoured craft-based production that inevitably failed to scale up or simply failed altogether. But the type of machines he loathed are now potentially a key to realising some of our ambitions for more meaningful work by helping to free time and capacity for employees to be more productive and more fulfilled. And one of the places I visited for my book is Unto This Last, a furniture workshop based in an old Victorian pub on Brick Lane in the East End of London that adapts the philosophy of Ruskin and the best of Toyota's lean manufacturing system and applies it on a small scale to the production of plywood core furniture. And Olivier Geoffroy, the founder there, employs a production manager who has one goal that marks her role out from others with a similar title at other manufacturers and gives it a Ruskinian ring to make everybody's job interesting. While writing my book and talking about the importance of Ruskin's ideas today, I've become very fond of Ruskin's triad of preconditions for happiness at work. For workers to be happy, he wrote, these three things are needed. They must be fit for it, they must not do too much of it, and they must have a sense of success in it. First of all, fitness. I think this means more than physical health. It means having the right education, training, apprenticeships, leading to mastery. Second, they must not do too much of it, which is an objective we can all agree on, but it's not a slacker's charter. I think it's a call for better regulation, for more humane management, for oversight of the growing gig economy, where one person's freedom to decide when he or she works and for how long is another's enslavement to an algorithm. And Ruskin today, I think, would be preoccupied with the excesses of those parts of the economy, the bottom of the rung jobs that the WMC is educating people to occupy as a first step towards mastery, the Deliveroo workers and Uber drivers, the migrant tomato pickers I heard about when I visited the community of Ruskin, Florida. And today, probably the many workers whose jobs are threatened as economies stumble through the pandemic. Third, there's this sense of success. And this, I think, is very good as an objective because we rarely declare victory at work. Instead, day by day, we edge towards a sense of success. And it seems to me a modest but noble and attainable goal. And on John Ruskin's own terms, therefore, we should be encouraging places that imbue this sense of success in their workers or learners, because as a byproduct of the workers' own happiness and sense of fulfillment, they ought quite simply to produce better work. All these Ruskinian lessons have taken on new relevance, I think, in the past 6 months as we've grappled with the uncertainty of the pandemic and its consequences. The older Ruskin would certainly have self-isolated during the pandemic, as he tried to in 1900 during the flu epidemic to which he eventually succumbed. He once wrote, "The practical immediate office of the earthquake and pestilence is to slay us like moths, and as moths we shall be wise to live out of their way." But Ruskin would, I think, also have recognized how during lockdown we came to appreciate the people, the objects, and the natural world immediately around us. Many of us started to indulge in the sort of close looking that Ruskin advocated. Some of us were encouraged to draw or paint. With flights grounded, we looked up again and appreciated the clouds and skyscapes that Ruskin observed and depicted in his own time. Forced out of our usual workplaces, many people started to think more deeply about the meaning of their work and what constitutes fulfillment in a craft or a trade or a profession. Confronted with the real sacrifices and hard work of frontline staff at hospitals, care homes, delivery centres and in shops, we've realised how important it is to follow Ruskin's advice and nurture, not neglect, the connections that bind us. Most obviously, faced with the threat of disease, we've had good reason to reflect on John Ruskin's best known aphorism, from unto this last, and to acknowledge that there is no wealth but life. And there's a final lesson for us, I think, from Ruskin in these difficult times, and it comes in the second part of that famous quotation, where he wrote that man or woman is richest who, having perfected the functions of his own life to the utmost, has also the widest helpful influence, both personal and by means of his possessions, over the lives of others. In his own lifetime, Ruskin tried to deploy his extraordinary gifts and wealth to help others through the Guild of St. George. In setting up the charity, he wrote, "For my own part, I will put up with this state of things passively not an hour longer. I will endure it no longer quietly, but henceforward, with any few or many who will help, do my poor best to abate this misery." And this, I think, is the kind of ambition that we can now apply to shape our post-pandemic world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for what has been a fascinating and very forward-looking dialogue about Ruskin and his relevance for today. And I think just ending on that poignant note about health and wealth that we all feel so grateful for, and the opportunity to be closer to nature in the last few months. I know everyone at the Watts and elsewhere has enjoyed that sort of Ruskinian element to lockdown. So thank you, enormous thanks for joining us. We have a few questions, and audience members, please feel free to use the Q&A function in the next few minutes as we ask Andrew a little bit more about his book. Let me just run through these. So firstly, a question about why are you so committed to demonstrate the relevance of Ruskin to modern life?
Well, I've laid out some of that in the, go back to first principles, I suppose. I found it fascinating that there were so many parallels between Ruskin's thinking, or some of Ruskin's thinking, and the situation that I encountered when I first read Unto This Last in 2009, which was just after the financial crisis. And I mean, I am interested always in the way in which it's possible to find some answers, or at least hints about how we might solve today's questions in the thinking of people who have already gone through something similar. Obviously not identical and not in any way exactly comparable with what we're going through now. But certainly offering, I think, some hints. And, you know, I say in the book very clearly, there are lots of parts, which we may get to, lots of parts of Ruskin's thinking that I don't agree with, lots of ideas that don't have relevance today. But I don't see there's anything wrong with picking and choosing from 9 million words, as I mentioned, of Ruskin thought, and finding things that inspire us to look at our world in a new way. I mean, this was a man who never had to do a formal job, and yet fretted all the time that he wasn't working hard enough. And so he was putting in a great deal of thought, which we may in our own time not have time to do. And so I think it's valuable to go back and have a look at that. I suppose, as easily have chosen other thinkers of other times, but Ruskin was the one who appealed to me and who found me, if you like.
If you had 5 minutes with Ruskin today, what would you want to ask him?
Well, I think probably first of all, I'd like to tell him how his work has survived. And I don't mean just the ideas, but also, of course, the fabulous drawings, some of which are on display at the gallery, and which you can see in other parts of the world. And these days you can see lots online as well, which is a great way of studying some of the very fine drawing and painting that he did. Because in the latter part of his life, and some people have attributed his eventual breakdown in part to this, he was extremely worried that nobody was listening. Even as painters like some of the Impressionists in France were picking up his ideas on drawing, and people like William Morris and his followers were applying or starting to apply some of his ideas in the political sphere, he worried that nobody was out there listening. So I think that's what I'd want to tell him, first of all, sort of reassure him that his ideas were being heard. I think if I were going to ask him one thing, it would probably relate to, I'd probably want to ask him about technology, actually, because although he abhorred it, as I said, and spent a lot of time railing against steam engines and railways, the building of railways, I think it was a little bit more complicated than that. And there's a great story that I retell in the book about how he, later in life, one of his disciples came to visit him. This was somebody who had so absorbed the Ruskin's hatred of railways that he decided the only way that he couldn't consign the letter that he wanted to send to Ruskin to the post office, to the Royal Mail, because it would end up going on a train and that would be bad. So this chap hiked all the way to the Lake District, knocked on Brantwood's door and told Ruskin that he had decided to deliver it by hand because he didn't want it to use the railways. And Ruskin said, well, you're a fool. I use the railways to get around. I'm just saying that I think that's kind of a bad thing in general. So I think his concern about technology was in part a sort of polemical way of behaving. And I think now it would be interesting to show him what goes on at the workshop unto this last and ask him what he really thought about the application of some of these tools to make actually workers happier in some regards. I'd like to dig into that a bit.
In that respect, Andrew, do you feel like we are entering a sort of a new Ruskinian age, not just Ruskinland, but this move towards an interest in craft and design, in using our hands, all of the things that you said about baking at home, tending our gardens, caring for the environment? Do you feel that that's more of an issue or more of a concern for a lot of people now than it has been?
I think a lot of people have realised that there are things close to them. They don't need to travel madly. Of course, we'd all like to have more freedom. We'd like to have the choice of being able to go to places. And Ruskin himself was probably the world's greatest 19th century tourist, you know, spending time shuttling between Venice and the Lake District almost throughout his life. So there's some contradictions there, but at the same time, I think what he showed was that you could actually, as he put it, you know, see a mountain in a pebble if you spent time looking closely at objects, drawing them ideally was the way he saw it as the way of engaging the brain. You could actually get as much out of that experience as you could from flying and traveling madly around. And what he hated about the railways, actually, among other things, was that people moved so fast. He just couldn't see how anyone would be able to ponder the beauty of the landscape if they were rushing past it. Now, of course, ironically, we would take a railway in preference to a jet as a kind of way of enjoying the sort of the landscape slowly unfolding. So I think what's happened during lockdown for many people, what I hope has happened, is that they have realized that there is something closer to home, literally, that they can stop and appreciate. And I kind of hope that when things eventually get back to more like normal, we don't just suddenly press the accelerator again and rush off. We may not be able to, simply because the options may not be there. It may still be difficult to travel about. And therefore we take a bit more time to think, you know what, actually, the time I spent in my garden was time well spent, and perhaps a staycation isn't any longer a bad thing.
We've had a question here about Ruskin as an activist, and do you think that he would have been part of Extinction Rebellion if he was around today?
I didn't really talk about this in the talk, but of course he did a very famous late lecture called The Storm Cloud of the 19th Century, which is very much taken by the Green Movement as an early sort of proto-environmentalist rant, really, because it was extremely apocalyptic in his vision of what was happening as pollution became a problem, which nobody had really highlighted until then. But I'm not sure that he would be an activist as such. He tended to be somebody who inspired others to activism, William Morris being an obvious example in the socialist movement. And in reality, he was a contradictory figure, as I said, but he was quite sort of conservative in his activism. He did back various movements in the Lake District to prevent the landscape there being despoiled, but he really inspired people to fight back against the building of reservoirs or railways. And when he was seen on the front line, he tended to show a bit of a lack of judgment about the things that he backed. When he kind of didn't engage his brain, when he started to follow things, he tended to get the judgment wrong. So I'm not sure that he would have been on the front line, but he might well have been as part of the 9 million words there, or beyond the 9 million words. He was always writing letters to newspapers. He would certainly have been in there backing the things that Extinction Rebellion was based on. And he would doubtless have applauded some of the principles that lie behind that, even if he perhaps as a small c conservative might have abhorred some of the methods.
Thank you. You've mentioned a few times that he wrote 9 million words. So for someone who is new to his writing, what one text or book would you most recommend of Ruskin's as an introduction to his thinking?
Well, I can't say that Ruskin is an easy read. I think that would be, it is a bit of an acquired taste. Unto This Last is probably one of the shorter works, in part because it was so badly received. It was intended as a series of essays and for a magazine edited by William Thackeray, actually the novelist. And there was such a backlash to the first few that Thackeray, for once, said stop. And so as a result, it's quite short, mercifully short. But even then, that is quite hard work. I mean, I would say that there are ways into Ruskin. He has written so much that you can dip in almost to anything that he's written and find wonderful passages of prose. There are some very good Ruskin readers, if you like. There's a Cambridge Companion that I'd recommend, which includes sort of highlights from some of the works. And you can do worse than start, if you're interested in this idea of the meaning of work, with The Nature of Gothic, which was a chapter from Stones of Venice that inspired Morris. And that has some wonderful passages in it about work and the way in which we think about art and the fulfillment of work as creating artwork. The Nature of Gothic, that probably would be the one I'd first recommend. But it's some of that, highlights from that are contained in some of the Ruskin companions that you can find on sale.
And of course your book as well.
Absolutely, I should have said that first of all.
Just a couple more questions. So you mentioned the community that was founded in Ruskin's name in the States. Do you know of any other groups or countries that have been inspired to do the same?
I started the book, I suppose, research for the book, idly Googling in spare moments the places named after Ruskin. And Ruskin, Florida was one that fascinated me from the start, because it's the one that is still going. Not that there is really a Ruskinite community there any longer. That petered out in the 1920s. But there is a place, and there are people you could visit, as I did, and even buildings that were sort of inspired by Ruskin's ideas. There's a strange building now on the National Register of Historic Monuments in the States, which is modelled strangely for Florida on a Swiss chalet that Ruskin described in one of his early works on architecture. So there are other places named after Ruskin, mountains, communities around the world. I mean, the theory here is that probably what happened was when Ruskin was in later life, lots of people were producing kind of bootleg copies of his work all around the world. He didn't quite get back control of the estate until later, when George Allen, his publisher, started to publish cheaper versions. Ruskin very much liked to publish books that were highly expensive and beautiful to read, but out of the reach of many people. So he was so popular that the books were reproduced. And the theory is people were taking, as it were, these paperbacks in their back pockets. Explorers were fanning out across Canada, Australia, the United States, and founding places based on this man's influence. Not even clear whether he really knew that that's what was happening. And again, if I met him, that would be something one might want to say to him: look, you're everywhere now.
A question here about Beatrix Potter, and did Ruskin know her as a conservationist of the Lake District? Was he kind of aware of other environmentalists at the time? Well,
of course, they're shackled together in the UNESCO bid. They were two pillars, together with Wordsworth, of that bid for UNESCO recognition for the Lake District. Beatrix Potter was much younger than Ruskin. She knew of him and found him very odd. I think there's a footnote in my book about Beatrix Potter and Ruskin. That might be because she had a connection with John Everett Millais, and John Everett Millais, as everybody knows, was eventually married Effie Gray after the annulment of her marriage to Ruskin. And of course, Ruskin and Effie then didn't really get on, and some of the stories that were told about Ruskin probably found their way back indirectly to Beatrix Potter. So I'm not sure that she had much time for Ruskin. Whether he knew about her, I'm not sure I've seen any evidence of that, although clearly, you know, their homes are just a very short walk from, or short drive from each other, between Coniston and Windermere.
Thank you. I think we've got one last question here, which is, it's about the current situation actually, and thinking about both the political environment we find ourselves in, but also this idea of health and wealth and poverty that we seem to be faced with on a daily basis, particularly in the current kind of crisis. And what do you think kind of Ruskin would have made of this, and what would his advice be for political leaders at this time?
Well, as I hinted, Ruskin didn't really like parliamentary politics. He was pretty scathing about all politicians, and particularly about Parliament. So he would have been disgusted by the goings-on in Parliament. Actually, this is a version of the question I got asked all the time last year when I was touring the book around, which was always about Brexit. So politically, I think he would have felt that politicians didn't necessarily have, you know, much to offer. I mean, he was very interested in public health. He, as I said, inspired ultimately the establishment of the welfare state. So I think he would have been fascinated by, and might well have contributed to, the debate about the National Health Service and the way in which that's operating. And I think he would have definitely, as I suggested, felt that he had something to say about the inequality that this pandemic potentially is opening up and exacerbating. It's worth mentioning here that clearly all this lockdown, close looking and sitting in the garden and being able to do things which we hadn't thought of doing before, applies only to those of us who have gardens and the time and wherewithal to be able to spend time in them. And Ruskin might well have been much more concerned, I think, about those frontline workers, those who were forced or obliged or had to, for various reasons, go into work and continue working, people who were thrown onto furlough and, you know, had to live through or are living still through uncertainty. I think all of that would have concerned him very greatly. And actually in the Watts letter that I quoted at the beginning of the talk, that did resonate with me, that Watts was saying, things are going so badly, we really need to hear your voice, Ruskin, at this moment. And, my sense is that there are so many voices clashing, both here about the pandemic, in the United States, about the forthcoming presidential elections, on every issue of cultural back and forth, that having somebody who could speak with that level of authority might well have been valuable. And as I say, I think he would have pitched in insofar as it was possible before he entered his later years. I'm sure he would have been pitching in. But my feeling is that, in a way, the later Ruskin was out looking for a kind of to stir things up, and that was sometimes good, but sometimes, as I've mentioned, it got him down, it drew him down cul-de-sacs and dead ends that he shouldn't have really been in. But I'd like to think that he would have had a strong feeling about the issues of today, seen through his very interesting lens of empathy, really, for the ordinary worker, which, perhaps this is where one should leave it. One of the most extraordinary things really about Ruskin is somebody who was born to this enormous wealth and privilege, could easily have just squandered his life, somehow managed to forge this extraordinary connection with everybody he met, whether they were kings and queens and generals or ordinary working people. And that, to me, seems to be something that's very valuable and worth taking away from his life.
Thank you, Andrew. I think that's a kind of really thoughtful place to leave this evening's discussion. A huge thank you again for bringing such a fascinating subject to us, for marking the first talk in our public programme, but also elucidating Ruskin's life and work in such a new way. And I hope that this evening's event will encourage everyone who's listening and who's asked such interesting questions to pick up a copy of Andrew's book, and also to visit our exhibition onto this last, which is open, as I mentioned, until the 1st of November. So huge thanks again to Andrew, to the Watts Gallery, my director Alistair Burton-Shaw, and all our trustees for supporting our online public programme. To my co-host Caris Martin for coordinating this talk so brilliantly and managing any technical issues. And I hope for everyone in the audience that you've enjoyed this evening and that you will consider joining us for the next talk in our series on Tuesday evening at 6 o'clock. Professor Tim Barringer and the artist Edmund Duval, who will be in conversation about the influence of Ruskin on their own lives. And further details about this can be found on our website. Again, Andrew, huge thanks. Good luck with the rest of your book talks, and thank you again to everyone for joining us this evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.